So data governance predates privacy in many ways. You've been talking a lot about privacy. How is OneTrust approaching data governance differently? What's different?
Yeah, there's a couple things that stand out that are fundamentally different. One, data governance does predate the modern privacy, if you will. The first fundamental thing I would say is different is data governance traditionally has been the data governance team did data governance in a company. So it's kind of a group or an entity that did it. And the mindset of it, again, was typically around compliance oriented. Now, privacy, again, shifting to that broader trust thing, made it much more of a top level important business driver and potential business enabler for the company. So it's sort of leveled it up. On a more operational level, though, some of the biggest fundamental differences that we see happening in practice is privacy. To give you some context, there is no privacy business group in a company. It's typically one person at best. And it's a chief privacy officer who has a legal background. They're not an operational or a technology person in many, many cases. Those teams are growing, but just to kind of be a little dramatic of that. So by default, privacy projects to get privacy ready for GDPR, ready for CCPA in the US, it had to be crowdsourced from the company. So it required this crowdsourcing and collaboration, not just this data governance team, doing data governance work in the data governance system. It was like, it had to be crowdsourced and integrated into the business. The second kind of thing that is unique and different about what privacy is driving is automation is key. Everyone is really realizing that this is not a one and done project initiative to kind of, hey, we get our Sarbanes-Oxley compliance and then we're kind of maintaining it. Right. It is something that is there's going to be more data protection laws and regulation and more governing kind of requirements that are driven out of privacy. And that is putting a focus in a big significant way on data discovery technologies to kind of automate and get embedded intrinsically into the processes that people are doing to discover that. And things like user, data access hygiene are fundamentally different. Like not necessarily having a governance tool that is a glorified, let's just say SharePoint site or something that just says, here's our policies and rules and what we should and shouldn't do. But the actual day-to-day stuff that's happening is way over here. And unless someone just checks that, nothing's actually happening. Embedding that in so it's truly enforced is a fundamentally different thing.
Yeah, so that's the notion of not being a passive process, but being an active process.
That's a great way to say it.
Part of the, what do we call it? Back in the day, Ford said, quality is job one. And everybody understood that quality was their day job, embedded in their day job, then quality improved at Ford and they became who they are today. So it's a great analogy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of sort of analogies and sort of new interesting ways to describe some of the challenges that we face, you guys really have wrapped around this idea of data intelligence. And I like that. So how does OneTrust define data intelligence?
Yeah, there's so much that can come from having this information available, for you. And the way we think of it is to achieve your goal as a CDO of understanding the value of your data, you have to, do a couple things. And getting to that state of intelligence really starts with first understanding your data. And that's where the discovery comes in. That's where classification is really transformed over the past few years, where traditionally classification was very, just to give some examples, like, hey, I'm looking for a 9-digit pattern anywhere. And that means it's going to be a social security number, or this is a certain pattern of a code, and that's going to be a credit card. And, that's the classifying of data. It's moved to a very contextual understanding of the data. So understanding, for example, where you got data from and how it correlates to other sets of data is even more powerful than just the flat data by itself. So the understanding is one key area of understanding your intelligence. The second is around what we call that governing and kind of creating of the rules. And having good clarity, like it's great to know you have all this data, but if you don't have guidelines and understanding of what you can and can't do with that data, it's hard to really operationalize using it, because ultimately you need to use it to get the value.
That's right.
So you need to create and understand what are the guardrails of what you can and can't do. And that has shifted quite a bit in the context of things like consent. There's various types of data where the world is kind of moving to this model of like, you can't do retargeting of advertising on the internet without explicit consent of processing or sharing that data with the parties that you are using to retarget it with. And there's going to be a lot more movement and things like that over the next few years. So understanding, governing. The third big bucket is expanding the awareness and actually using it. And this is where giving light to the awareness that data does exist in the business, enabling the self-service of those things. Because you put those rules in place, you're able to accelerate and give clarity of what you can and can't use, which drives use. And I think a simple example of this is before there were traffic laws around in the US and in the early days, like it was the Wild West with cars, and nobody knew like when do I stop and when do I not, and who yields to who at a traffic intersection. So everything was slowed down. And once you get the the guardrails in place and everyone's clear on it, it actually speeds everything up. Cars have been able to go significantly faster since many of those things were put in place. So use and expansion of that does that. And then obviously the next tier of intelligence for us is just how do you start to improve the quality of your data and do things like, stewardship, ownership, relevance of data, and just capturing more data, capturing the context of the data so you understand that from the use of it. So all that comes together to kind of give you data intelligence as an organization.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Blake, I'm loving this interview. And I'll tell you why, because I really think that it ought to become required listening for every C-suite leader across the globe, actually. I think this is a great set of business-related raison d'etres for understanding governance and privacy and acceptable use and enabling use and consumption of data. Like if we think about money, if we lock money in a vault and do nothing with it, we get no value. Money only generates value when it's circulating, when it's being used, but it still has to be protected. So I think this interview is fascinating so far, and I'm looking forward to the next few questions. But I'm going to really work hard on the application to get this interview out in front of our C-suite readers and listeners, because I think they can walk away from this conversation with a lot of insight that'll be valuable to the CDOs out there whom they've hired and empowered to get some things done. So that's just my little editorial postscript in real time. Let's move on to the next question. What does the data governance journey look like for a OneTrust customer? And I think hopefully I set that up nicely, because if you get the value proposition and you bring the technology in, your journey is going to change. So tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think as I've kind of outlined as we've gone through some of this, most of our customer base is typically focused on, a privacy or governance or compliance type program. Obviously, that North Star for anyone using data, to your point, is how do I get the value out of it, and what is that value? But most of our customers start with that, basic discovery of their data. And I think many of them focus on maybe specific types of data sets. Like, for example, we have a lot of customers that are looking at how do we take advantage of some of these modern data cloud platforms, a Databricks, a Snowflake, but we know we need those guardrails in place, and we need to understand the implications of, the worst thing you can do from and maybe this is a governance view of life, but the worst thing you can do is take all that data that had the context of where it come from and what system and just kind of dump it in the lake and lose all that metadata around it. And then it becomes this, again, Wild West of like, well, where did this come from? And how, you don't even know, like, can we even do anything? We're at a stalemate with ourselves. So enabling those types of business projects is one key thing. Helping you obviously solve consent specific requirements around what you can use data for that goes into that. We have a whole, as part of our governance kind of solution, we help you go from the moment you captured the data, almost capturing a data transactional receipt. So just like a financial receipt of like, you bought this from this merchant, and you get a transactional receipt of the like what was exchanged, this date and time, this product. We do that for data, and that flows into that downstream pipe of that data lake. So you can actually see like, wait, we can use this data, but only a subset of it, because the data from Europe can only be used for this type of a product, or you can use this data, but it's got to be anonymized or masked. And there's these different technologies that are part of that help enable it. So the typical journey is building off of some of those things are what our customers go through.